talked about dogs. I think when we last left off, we were talking about artificial selection. Now, artificial selection
like breeding dogs.
Is when humans choose what survives and what mates. Like breeding. All the dogs, species, all came from the wolf. Humans selectively bred dogs to have certain characteristics. Dogs that could smell better, dogs that could see better, dogs that were big and could attack and defend, dogs that could be real small and chase around rats and protect crops. So, dogs have been very useful and we've bred them for years. Horses the same way. The thoroughbred racehorse is twice as big as an actual wild horse because we've bred them to be bigger and faster, you see. Darwin himself bred pigeons. And he would, on purpose, he'd take the pigeon with the fanciest feathers, he called them fanciest, and he'd mate them with other pigeons with fancy feathers. And some of the, there's variations. So some of the ones that were born would have even fancier feathers. And some would have less fancy. And he'd take the ones with the even fancier feathers and breed them. And very quickly you could breed a pigeon that had all these neat colors in its feathers. And Darwin did that, and he called that artificial selection. Let me tell you about the Heike crab. Have you ever heard of this organism?
What crab?
The Heike crab. The Heike crab is in a certain part of China, or of Japan, I'm sorry, there were these warriors, there were these samurai warriors that were surrounded by their enemies. And one of the code of the samurai is you never captured. You never let yourself become captured. So, as they were closing in, Emery and Jessica, as the enemies were closing in on the samurais, they threw themselves on their swords and fell into the ocean. And there's this little fishing village in that area. And the story of the brave samurais that fell on their swords is big in their area. And if you ever catch a crab, and look at the back of the crab in this fishing area. Let me draw a little crab for you.
Is it red?
Hold on. Here's a crab. The crab shell, And the crabs, they got the claws, right? And they got the little eyes, right? That's a crab. Huh? Can you tell it's a crab? You look on the back of the crab, and the crabs have all these little marks on their back to let them blend in to their surroundings. You don't just want to have a plain back all the way. That doesn't break you up from your surroundings. But when you put little marks on it, it lets you blend in. Well, it was said in this area that if you ever found a crab with marks on the back that looked something like a human face, you got to throw that crab back, because that is the soul of a samurai in the crab.
So
and so you got to throw those back that have marks that look like faces. And this story has been going on in this area for several hundred years. So think about what's happening here. They're eating the crabs with no marks on their backs, and they're throwing the ones back with marks on their backs that look like faces.
Oh.
This is artificial selection. You know what the crabs look like now?
A lot of faces.
Oh my gosh!
The crab not only has a back that looks like a face, but it has a back that looks like a samurai.
Wow.
What are these crabs called? I don't see a face.
They're called Heike crabs.
There's a nose.
Eye,
eyes.
nose, the thing that area that goes down in the mouth there.
Wait.
And it's a Japanese face. The Heike crab.
How do you spell that?
Yeah.
Really, really big nose, yeah.
Heicke. And this is a an example of artificial selection. Humans choosing what lives and what doesn't. And you can make the back of that crab look like anything you want. In this case, they made it look like a samurai warrior.
So like.
But none of these crabs get eaten.
So like soon, like all of them are gonna look like that.
That's right. All of them do look like that. All of this type of crab.
Do they not eat them?
Nope. They have to just eat fish. They don't get to eat crab.
Oh.
When the fish start getting faces.
The fish. Yeah. Well, they got to eat, so they aren't going to make that rule with fish. Eat whatever fish you want. Isn't that interesting? Plants have undergone artificial selection the same way. The vegetables Chinese cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and kohlrabi are derived from wild mustard, Brassica oleacea. Darwin described artificial selection as a model by which to understand natural selection. With natural selection, however, the environment, not humans, provide the selective force. So humans can change the back of a crab to look like a face, but the environment normally provides the pressure to change the organisms. But the important thing here is change. Organisms change. And can change from one form to another over time, given enough selective pressure and enough time. Organisms can change. Those crabs didn't always look like that. You can find fossilized crabs in the area where those Heike crabs are, and the old crabs didn't have backs that looked like faces, just the ones since humans started that process of throwing back the ones that look like faces. These are Darwin's finches. Darwin's finches are very famous. One of the things Darwin found on the Galapagos Island were finches. It's a type of bird. And he found on the island 13 different finch species. They're still there today. On the Galapagos, yeah.
You see any?
Oh yeah, they're all over the place. I got some pictures here that I took. I'll show you. One of the things he noticed about the finches were they had different sized beaks. On one island they'd have small thin beaks. On another island they'd have real big fat beaks. And see, the different islands had different food sources. Some islands just had insects that were in trees, and you had to reach in there with your beak to get the insect out of a little hole in a tree. And on that island, all the birds have really long, thin beaks. Other islands, the only thing to eat is nuts that are hard to crack open. And on that island, all the finches have real thick, hard beaks that can crack open nuts. And so there's all these 13 different kinds of finches with all these different beak sizes. Well, on mainland Ecuador, there's only a couple types of finches. So why, when you go to this little group of islands, do you have 13 types of finches, and on the mainland that's huge, you only got a couple types of finches?
You have 13 different islands.
Because you got 13 different areas with different food sources, you see, and that causes evolution to happen by having the different types of food. You're favored if you're born with a beak that's bigger, if the only type of food source is these nuts that are hard to crack open. So the ones with beaks that can't crack open those nuts, they all die out, and the only ones that survive are the ones with the thick beaks. And pretty soon, all the finches on that island have thick beaks. And on the other island, there aren't any thick beak ones. Because there's no nuts on that island, there's only insects. So evolution is shaping the organisms, and Darwin saw this and was smart enough to catch on to it. And said the birds from the mainland must have come to the island a long time ago and changed on each island. Crab? Isn't that cool? Here's pictures of finches. I took that one. That's a good picture, isn't it? That's a Tom Willis photograph. I'm selling these for money if you want to know. Isn't that a good one?
That is a good one.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I'm such
It's
a
like
great
on
photographer.
Festivus.
Little finches, they were everywhere. That's a big fin. Check this out. They've been studying these finches and measuring their beak size, scientists have, and they notice whenever there's a dry year that the beak size gets larger. And then when it's wet, the beak size goes down. So there's variability in, there's wet year, the beak size goes down. There's variability in, in just a couple of years' time, and from 77 to 84. So in 7 years' time, there's all these variations of how big the finches' beaks were. And that's because finches lay eggs every year, you see. And little babies are growing up and surviving. It only takes a finch a year or two to become an adult. So they notice that the ones, if it's a dry year, then you need a bigger beak because the shells are harder to crack. You see what I'm saying? If it's a wet year, you don't need as big of a beak. And so we see the average beak depth changing according to whether it was dry or wet. Isn't that interesting?
Evolution in action.
The average beak depth of medium ground finches varies from generation to generation according to the weather. The weather affects the hardness and size of seeds on the islands, and different beak depths were better suited for eating different types of seeds. Average beak features were observed to change many times over a period of a decade. This is one way in which evolution by natural selection has been observable over a short period of time. If you've ever heard someone say, oh, they don't know if evolution happens or not, they don't know if organisms change, it's just the theory, there's your evidence right there. That's changing. The beak sizes change over time. That's it. That's what evolution is.
So it's been proven.
That's proof. That's proof of evolution right there.
In the pudding.
And there's a lot. This isn't the only proof. You can find evidence like this for every species. Every species that changes, and if you take any measurement you want to, if there are some selective pressure, there has to be selective pressure, but organisms will change due to selective pressure. The Heike Crab is evidence of evolution. It's changed.
Humans came from monkeys.
Well, we'll talk about that when we do human evolution.
My favorite.
What is this talking about?
I'm talking about the fruit fly thing.
Wing spots in fruit flies. Male fruit flies have a spot on the leading edge of their wings that is not present in close relatives. Males flash the spot on their wings to attract the attention of females during a courtship dance. Why is it talking about that? I don't know.
Because it's saying
Probably
the
evolution.
black spots reproduced more and formed more with black spots because the females were attracted to the males with the black spots.
The black spot was attractive. That's what the females like. So they mated more and had more babies with that. Possibly that's what it's saying. Make sure you all read this tonight. I'm not going to be able to talk about everything in here. Yeah.
Do we know if animals know immediately what gender the other one is? I know.
No, they have to have signals and stuff.
So that's like a signal.
Yeah, that's a signal.
So that's why
right.
there's so many of them, because a female knows that that's a male.
That could be how they know.
I know there's some indications, but they don't know immediately.
Yeah, well, they have to have some sort of signal. Sometimes it's a chemical signal. Sometimes it's a hormone or something. Sometimes it's visual. Could be a smell. Could be a sound, a call, like birds use calls and stuff.
I was just thinking, because of course we would think a lot of birds look the same, but for a bird.
For a bird, they can tell. Yeah.
There's like peacocks.
They're living their whole lives looking at other birds.
Yeah.
You can start to figure it out. This is how, this is an ancient amphibian fossil. We know that amphibians evolved from fish. Fish evolved into amphibians. And we'll study that evolution a bit. But we call this a transitional fossil. This fossil is part like a fish and part like an amphibian. It has some similarities there. And they talk about some of the similarities here in your reading. But this fossil in between the two is not exactly like a fish, it's not exactly like an amphibian. We call that a transitional fossil. And if it's true that organisms change over time, and that something like an amphibian could evolve from something like a fish, then there ought to be some fossils in between the two that are sort of like fish and sort of like amphibians. We call those transitional fossils.
That's one right there.
That's one right there. They say that birds evolved from reptiles. Well, there ought to be a fossil that's kind of half bird, half reptile. And there is. There's lots of them. Archaeopteryx. Mm-hmm. And there's others. So, this is more evidence for evolution, these transitional fossils. If humans evolved from apes, that's what they say, shouldn't there be some half-human, half-ape fossils?
Yes.
They called that the missing link a long time ago because they had never found one. And then in the early 1970s, some archaeologists found one.
The leakies, right?
Yes.
How come it evolves into that, but one doesn't die out? Like, we still have fish, and we still have like, you get what I'm saying? Like, how come one doesn't die out?
Yeah, well, fish,
Do some of that break off?
there are millions of species of fish.
They emerge on.
And only one of those millions of species evolved into amphibians. The rest of the fish remain.
So, apes and us, why are there still apes if they're
Yeah,
still
there's still apes, and only one of the types of apes ended up evolving into humans in one location. Everywhere else, there's still apes. We're going to learn about that after the AP exam, because they don't test in AP biology on human evolution.
Well, how do we...
Yeah, why is it in the book, though, Mr. Willis? I was wondering about that. It's like chapter 30.
It is in the book. It's later in the book when they talk about vertebrates.
Why do they not have it on the AP exam?
It's too controversial.
Because they've cut a lot of stuff out of the AP exam, and that's one of the things that got cut. And just they're trying to shorten the amount of material you have to learn. But it's a very important part of biology, and it's a good example of evolution. So we're going to do it. We're just going to do it after the AP exam. Yeah.
So how come we evolved so much smarter than apes?
Yeah, that intelligence helped us survive. It was very, very useful.
But how?
Big brains.
How did we get, if we evolved from those, then how did we get so much smarter?
It's going to take 3 days for me to explain that story. And so I'm going to do it after the AP exam. But bigger brain, help make tools. Tools helps you survive. Helps you find food. Having a lot of food provides a lot of calories that can fuel a big brain. And it's what we call a positive feedback loop.
Bigger brains.
So the brains get bigger over time and help you survive over time.
And the species with the larger brain tend to live more because they
Tend
have
to
more
live
food.
better and
So-
look more and get more food, and so
More
so
big brain.
that's evolution just kind of continuing in a certain direction, and we see that in a lot of organisms, not just humans. Big brains help humans survive, but in other organisms, like elephants, a longer nose helped them survive, and it just got longer and longer. Now there's this huge long nose. Or peacock feathers. The prettier feathers helped them survive, so they got prettier and prettier. And now there's these huge, pretty peacock feathers. So we call this a positive feedback loop that moves some organ in a certain direction. And in us, it was brains that got real big. Yeah.
Okay, so was there any environmental change that caused a lot of humans to die out? So there had to be some kind of change.
Absolutely, there was. We went from forest to grassland.
Oh,
And humans had to evolve a way to survive
Okay.
in the grassland because the forests were disappearing. In the part of
Because we weren't
Africa, in
suited to
East
that.
Africa, around 7 million years ago, the forest started changing to grassland. That was the evolutionary pressure that led to human evolution. Again, 3 days on that, a whole chapter on that.
But we weren't suited to the environment, so some survival instinct.
The apes weren't suited to the environment,
Oh, yeah.
so they had to change or they'd die out. And so you know what they started doing? They started walking on 2 legs. That's the first thing.
Oh, I was talking about the brain though. Like
Yeah.
what triggered the brain?
Yeah, and then the first tool makers. Once you walk on two legs, your hands are free, and you can start making tools. And if you were better at making tools, you survived better. And so it started with walking upright, and then it went to hands free, and then just kind of ran away with it.
Cause and effect, right?
Look at this. This is the evolution of whales. Whales evolved from an organism that looked like this. We know this through the fossil record. And took to the water and found more food on water than it did on land. It used to run around on land. And slowly it started losing its limbs, especially its back legs. And all that's left of the back legs are two little tiny bones that are non-functional. We call these structures vestigial structures. That's a word you need to know. A vestigial structure is a very small structure that's kind of caught in the act of disappearing. Very similar to our tailbone and our little toe and our appendix. These are organs that are very small. In our ancestors, they were a lot bigger. But as evolution goes, you lose the need for things. Just like the whale lost the need for back legs, they were just kind of in the way. And so they got smaller and smaller. No reason to spend resources growing bones and taking care of bones that aren't needed. So if you're born with smaller bones, you have a little bit of advantage over the guy next to you, over the whale next to you that's born with bigger bones, leg bones. And so you gradually see these things disappear over time if they're not used and provide for your survival. Yes?
So like, this may be like a stupid question, but like since we have tailbones, so we like had tails?
We probably evolved from something that had tails. And if you go back to the fossil record and you look at it, you see we did. That monkeys have tails. And apes evolved from monkeys, and that's when the tail disappeared. And humans evolved from apes. And we're gonna learn
So why do we
about
still
all
have a
that later.
tailbone if it's been that long?
What's that?
Why do we still have a tailbone if it's been that long?
It's just going to get smaller and smaller. It takes a long time for something to disappear.
That'd be
And
weird.
it's not really in the way, so it doesn't really need to go.
It doesn't really hurt us.
Yeah.
It's not really helping us. And so when something gets to that stage where it's not really hurting, but it's not really helping, it takes it even longer to disappear. So you see a lot of vestigial structures on organisms. Scientists have found something like 110 vestigial structures on the human body. And you can go online and type vestigial structures on the human body, and you'll see the list of them. They go over all of them. There's a bunch of them. Wow. There's a little bump on your skull. That's one of them. Used to be a lot more important.
Wait, wasn't it used to be like longer?
Yeah, it used to be longer and have more muscles for jaws that could bite harder, and we don't need those strong jaws anymore. Why? Because we got tools that can bust things open for us. No reason to waste a lot of energy on making your jaw real strong when you can just use a nutcracker. Something you thought of.
But doesn't that
Save the energy.
I mean, can that sometimes be harmful because if there was for some reason we needed strong jaws again?
Yeah, it could be. Then we'd be in trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah. So evolution can take all sorts of turns.
Miss Willis?
Yes.
Did our immune system get worse when we started cooking food or something?
Probably. Probably so.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
That's why always cook your food.
This is one of Darwin's original. This is from his original notes. Once he thought of this concept of evolution, he said, "Well, let's go back in time then. If organisms are always changing, there must have been a single common ancestor to all organisms that changed into all the organisms we have now." And this is his original drawing showing that and talking about it.
I think.
And they've done much more modern, this is called an evolutionary tree. They've done much more modern evolutionary trees now with computers, and this is what they start to look like. But Darwin had sketched one. What if you could show him this nowadays? This is done on DNA evidence taken from various organisms. And they're making one of these now that contains every organism on the earth. And it's huge. It can't fit anywhere. It's in a computer because there's more than 40 million organisms we know about, and that number keeps growing. So that can't fit on one page.
What do the colors mean?
The blue means eukaryotes, and the red here, this red here means.
So they're gonna try to grow something with
Bacteria here, and this is archaea, bacteria, and eukarya.
There's bacteria in the blue part.
Are there?
It's a cyanobacteria.
I don't know that. I'm sorry.
Archaea in green, bacteria in red, and eukarya in purple. That's what the note says.
I don't know. You can read about it, but it's interesting stuff. That's an extra reading section.
Wombat.
Remember when I talked about Darwin's biogeography?
Yeah.
Australia is a very interesting place. Australia has been separated from the other continents for something like 200 million years. No, it's less than that. 50 million years. But one interesting thing is placental mammals never got to Australia. Marsupials are on Australia. And the marsupials are mammals with pouches. And placentals are mammals like us that give live birth to the young who don't develop in pouches. So, the placentals evolved into all of their different types on all the other continents, and the marsupials on Australia evolved into all their types. But if you look at the organisms on Australia, a lot of them are really similar to the organisms on the rest of the continents. For instance, here on the rest of the continents we have flying squirrels. There on Australia they have the sugar glider, which looks just like a flying squirrel. And they have this Australian wombat that looks just like a woodchuck. And they have the kangaroo running around that looks like this Patagonian cavy. And they need pictures of the other organisms so you can compare the two.
Don't people have sugar gliders as pets?
I don't know. That'd be
My
fun.
friend has one.
It flew away.
They glide away. Here's more evidence for evolution. If you look at the bones of different organisms, birds, bats, whales, cats, horses, humans, they all have the same bone structure. Even though whales have fins, and birds and bats have wings, and horses and cats have legs, they all have the same bone structure. They have a big one on the top, then two, and then a bunch of pebble-like bones, and then a bunch of long bones that look like fingers. Darwin asked, why would this be? If you were going to specially create an organism for swimming, and you were going to make a fin, why wouldn't you make it like a paddle with one big, long, fat bone that can push water? That would be make a lot more sense. Why would it have almost exactly the same structure as a leg of a cat or a horse? Why would it, if you're going to design a wing, why would you put the same bone structure as an arm? And the only good rational explanation for this is that all these organisms evolved from one organism that had that bone structure. And some evolved to be able to fly, and some evolved to be able to swim, and some evolved to be able to run, and they all kept the same bone structure, you see. The bone structure is conserved through all the organisms because of evolution. Darwin called these homologous... we stepped on the world. Darwin called these homologous structures. Homologous means similar.
Like homologous pairs.
That's correct. Anytime you see the word homologous, that's similar. And so all of these organisms have similar bone structure because they evolved from an organism with that bone structure. And that organism was a reptile. All mammals came from reptiles.
Wouldn't it be better to have the wings like that because it's more flexible though?
To have the wing like what? Which one?
Like instead of like one big bone, like have it a bunch of like.
That would be the
bones
swimming
out
one
there,
that'd have a big bone.
Maybe. I mean, if you look at the way we design modern wings and such, it's different from the way we design, paddles and things like that. So, why would they all look the same is what Darwin was trying to say. Another way you can study evolution is to look at the embryos of organisms. And if you look at the embryo of a fish, it looks a lot like a tortoise embryo and a chick embryo. And even a human embryo has a look to it that is a lot different from a human. Human embryos have tails, big long tails. And that tail disappears as the human develops. Human embryos have gill slits. They're also known as pharyngeal pouches. And those disappear and become part of our throat. Why would a human embryo have a tail and gill slits? If you were going to design a human at the start, why would you put tails and gill slits on it when those just disappear? Why not just have them not there? Well, if you look at the embryos and the way they change, maybe they're there because humans evolved from something that have tails, and since humans don't need them, the tail disappears in the development. You start from scratch with the same basic form, but you change it as the organism's developing. This is embryology, is what we call this whole science of studying embryos, embryology. And it points to the idea that evolution occurs. If humans evolved from something that had tails, that would make sense why there's still a tail in the embryo. I have a couple of videos I want to show you here, so I haven't put them in here. I thought I did. What? Let me go to my other... Oh!
Yeah.
What? You know what that is?
Archaeopteryx.
That's an Archaeopteryx. It's a half reptile, half bird.
But not every species survived from that time. Far from it. Here are some of the losers in the struggle we call evolution.
That's something else. Look at the horse. Look how horses have changed over time.
It's a lot of kingdoms.
Horses used to be the size of a dog.
Shakespeare joke.
And they got bigger over the years. So have camels. That's the bird evolutionary tree.
Looks like a tree.
That's the human evolutionary tree.
Joke.
Oh, here's one I wanted to show you. This is cool.
In the northern hemisphere, horses evolved to fill a herbivore's niche in the ecosystem. On the isolated continent of Australia, nature took a different tack. Instead of horses, evolution came up with kangaroos. If we ran evolution again,
there is a very strong chance element in exactly the way evolution goes. So, for example, I'd be fairly happy in predicting that we would get eyes, seeing organs, because eyes have indeed evolved about 9 times independently in different parts of the animal kingdom, and the same sorts of eyes have evolved several times independently. I'd be pretty confident carnivores, animals that we call herbivores, animals that we call parasites, and so on. And they would do their carnivory, their herbivory, and their parasitism in roughly the same ways, but they wouldn't be exactly the same.
It might not even finish up with an intelligent, communicating, talking animal. I mean, it's very striking that the dinosaurs ruled the Earth for 100 million years. They ran about on their hind legs, so their hands were free. There's nothing to stop them making tools. And yet they never invented or evolved an intelligent, speaking form.
Try to imagine what the Earth's dominant species would have looked like if dinosaurs had evolved instead of mammals. Paleobiologist Dale Russell of the Canadian Museum of Nature did that, and the result was a winsome green creature who probably would have been sure that it too was the inevitable outcome of biological history.
That's what dinosaurs would have looked like if they didn't go extinct.
So why would they have been that small though?
So they wouldn't be humans.
So why would they be that small though? Couldn't they be intelligent and like really big?
They could have. It was just a guess that some scientists made what they might look like. You know what that is? It's a cave fish.
Oh, they
blind, right?
They don't have eyes.
Yeah,
that little dot there, it can't see anything. So why is it there?
Because it used to be
It's a vestigial structure. It's evidence of evolution. Yeah.
If there's no light there, then what do they eat? If there's no plants to eat.
Oh, they can. There's stuff that. Yeah, there's stuff that can grow there. I don't know what they eat.
Yeah, like when I went to Mammoth Cave in Kentucky several years ago, crickets have no eyes and they're white, and if you expose them to white light, they explode. They're so adapted to the cave.
That's cool. Check this out.
Consider this 6-week-old human embryo. Now compare it with this embryo at a similar age. What looks like a human hand is actually the front foot of a pig. And this hand-like limb is merely the nascent wing of a chicken. Our hands, their feet and wings, sharing a common ancestry, binds together all animals with backbones.
That wasn't the one I wanted to show you. This is it. Which one's the human?
The one on the right. Bottom right.
Top left.
Top left.
Bottom.
Everybody make their guess.
Top left.
Are they all different?
They're all different.
Top left.
Top right. Top right.
Here we go.
Top left.
Although we pride ourselves on our uniqueness, can we even tell which one of these embryos is human? It takes weeks of growth before the answer is obvious.
Bottom right.
Fish, chicken, pig.
I said we were chicken.
I said it was a fish.
I know he goes chicken. I thought it wasn't going to be.
Okay. The last part of this section talks about the most evidence we have for evolution is DNA evidence, genetic evidence. Evidence from the proteins and such. For instance, if you look at human cytochrome C, cytochrome C is a protein in the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. This is one of those proteins that passes the electron off from one thing to another. Remember that? Remember the electron transport chain?
ETC.
So all of these organisms have mitochondria. Human and monkey cytochrome C is almost exactly the same. Almost no differences. This is number of differences on the left. And humans and monkeys are, as we find out through our study of evolution, very closely related. Their DNA is 99% similar, something like that, 97% similar. But human and pig cytochrome C are further apart from one another. And human and yeast cytochrome C have a lot of differences, 50 amino acid differences. So you can take comparisons of proteins and count the number of amino acids in the protein structure that are the same and use it to kind of build an evolutionary tree. Organisms with closer number of amino acids are close together on the tree. Organisms with greater numbers are further apart on the tree. You can build this evolutionary tree completely independent of any other evidence. And then you can look at an evolutionary tree made by fossil evidence, for instance, and compare the two. So it's a way of checking your answer. It's a way of checking if these guys, that, with all their fossils, if they have the history of the Earth and how organisms evolved, if they have it correctly, by doing data analysis on proteins.
Do monkeys need birth?
Do monkeys need birth?
Fur.
Oh, need fur. Yeah. Yeah.
They don't really look like.
Well, it's like I like the Japanese monkeys.
Sometimes it gets cold. Oh yeah, those guys
they
really
sit,
need
they
fur.
sit in like hot springs to keep warm.
Do we have hair?
We have hair too. It's just real
But
thin.
is the reason we don't have like hair all over our body because we invent clothes?
That's right.
Why don't we have
Hair only started to disappear when clothes